Today, we're diving into 3 shocking medical mysteries that are as bizarre as they are terrifying. And if you're into this kind of content, don't forget, we've got an award-winning podcast called MindCrime Medical Mysteries, where we uncover stories just like these every single week. So be sure to check it out. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Because that's all we do. We upload once a week. So if that sounds like your thing, go ahead and smack the like button like it's a fly hovering over your dinner. Also, make sure you subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss one of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's first story. On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, a woman named Linda Mercer was sitting at her computer on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was trying to focus on some recent bank statements, but her concentration kept breaking. Downstairs, she could hear her longtime partner, David Holloway, talking to someone. And for some reason, it was making her uneasy. Linda and David had been together for about 20 years. They weren't married, but they lived like they were, shared everything. In fact, Linda had even written David into her will. As far as she was concerned, they were in it for life. But lately, things hadn't felt so solid. The relationship had grown tense. Arguments were more frequent. They'd even discussed breaking up. Nothing definite, but the cracks were forming, and Linda couldn't stop thinking about it. So, as she sat upstairs, trying to do finances while her mind spiraled with she suddenly heard David yelling from downstairs. At first, it sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he'd been talking to, but within seconds, she realized he wasn't angry. He was screaming in pain. She leaped from her chair and ran downstairs. What she saw was burned into her memory forever. A man in a white lab coat was walking calmly out the front door. His back was to her, and she didn't recognize him, but something about him felt oddly familiar. She barely had time to process it before she heard another groan behind her. She turned and saw David collapsed in the living room, clutching his shoulder, face contorted in pain. Panicked, she rushed to him. What happened? Who was that guy? Through clenched teeth, David told her that the man had just given him a COVID vaccine, that he was from the NHS and had stopped by to administer the shot at home. But Linda wasn't buying it. Since when do NHS workers just show up to people's houses without notice? Still, David was clearly in serious pain. He was pale, sweating, rocking back and forth, moaning. She offered to drive him to the hospital, but he refused. He said the NHS guy had told him pain like this was normal with this particular vaccine, and that it would go away on its own. Against her better judgment, Linda agreed to wait, but over the next 48 hours, things got much, much worse. The injection site on David's arm turned red, then blistered, then started to bleed, and finally, it turned black. That's when Linda rushed him to the emergency room. Doctors examined him and diagnosed him with necrotizing fasciitis, a horrifying condition also known as fleshating disease. It's a rare, fast-moving bacterial infection that destroys skin, tissue, and muscle from the inside out. If they didn't operate immediately, David could die. But there was something that didn't add up. The doctors needed to understand how this had started, and the typical causes didn't match David's symptoms, so they asked, had anything unusual happened before this pain began? That's when David told them about the man who came to the house. As he described, the man in the lab coat, his voice, his posture, his face, Linda felt her heart stop. It all clicked. She did recognize that man. It was her son, Thomas Mercer. He had been wearing a wig and makeup, and the lab coat had thrown her off. But now, there was no mistaking it. Thomas had injected David, not with a COVID vaccine, but with something else. Something far worse. The truth was horrifying. Thomas had secretly acquired a highly toxic agricultural pesticide called iodomethane, a substance so dangerous it can cause immediate tissue death and organ failure, and that's exactly what he had injected into David's arm. But why? Thomas had recently learned that Linda had written David into her will. That meant when she passed away, her house, the home Thomas had grown up in, would go to David, not him. In his twisted mind, there was only one solution. David had to die, but David didn't die. Thanks to the UR doctors and a series of intense surgeries, they were able to stop the infection and save his life. Though his recovery was long and painful, as for Thomas, he was arrested, convicted of attempted murder, and sentenced to 31 years in prison. You know that feeling when you're totally immersed in a story, where your heart races, your mind spins, and you're glued to every word from start to finish. That's the exact experience Audible brings to you. Whether you're craving some pulse-pounding suspense or looking to get lost in a true crime mystery, Audible has something to satisfy every dark and curious mind.